Harper Wells had mastered the art of passing through airports without being seen. A black wool coat, hair swept into a low knot, sunglasses even in January. She could cross 3 terminals without a single camera catching more than a silhouette. Today should have been no different. But halfway to the Skyark private gate at O'Hare, she slowed. Beyond the glass, through the slow shuffle of travelers, she saw him, Ben Carter. He was older, his hair darker at the roots, lighter at the edges, a quiet silver beginning at his temples, but his posture was the same. The way he carried himself, shoulders slightly forward as though still guarding someone. And there they were, 2 girls. One, maybe 12, with her hood up, scanning the crowd with a careful kind of distance. The other, younger, holding his hand and watching his lips intently as he bent to speak. Harper's gaze caught on the glint of the younger girl's cochlear implant. She remembered vaguely how Ben had once signed the word safe into her palm when they'd walked a street too loud for speech. The terminal noise dulled to a hum. Maddie and June. She knew their names instantly, though she had never met them. He had never told her. And still she knew. She had convinced herself she had moved on. That her life was altitude and boardrooms, not small kitchens and after-school pickups. But the sight of him, of them, cracked something open so sharply she felt her breath catch. Ben turned his head, scanning for their gate. For a moment his eyes swept the glass. She almost lifted her hand. Almost. Then Maddie tugged at his sleeve, and the moment was gone. Her flight to Tokyo was boarding in 12 minutes. She turned toward the Skyark lounge, but her reflection in the glass looked like someone who had just missed more than a connection. Back in San Francisco, the glass walls of Skyark's top floor caught the late afternoon light and threw it in fractured pieces across Harper's desk. She had been staring at a contract for the past 20 minutes, reading the same line over and over without seeing it. Her office door opened without a knock. Only Rowan did that. Her chief analyst was tall, dry-witted, and one of the few people allowed to bring her bad news without sugarcoating it. "You're going to want to sit," he said, dropping a slim folder on her desk. "I'm already sitting." "Then brace yourself." Harper's gaze stayed on the folder for a long second before she flipped it open. The first page was a printout from a public records search. Benjamin Carter, Boise, Idaho, owner of something called Northside Sound. The photo was recent, grainy but unmistakable. "A recording studio?" she asked. "Small, mostly for teenagers. Local bands, kids from the high school. He teaches part-time." Rowan hesitated. "He's not in great shape." Harper looked up sharply. "Early-stage cardiomyopathy," Rowan said, his voice low. "It's public in the sense that his insurance filings are on record, but he's not broadcasting it. Probably not many people know." The words landed heavy. Harper closed the folder, as if the act could push them back inside. "That's not all." Rowan slid a second sheet forward, an invoice from a music licensing agency Skyark had used 2 years ago, when they quietly commissioned a corporate jingle for a global ad campaign. The composition had come through an intermediary, no composer name attached. "You remember how this was purchased anonymously?" Rowan asked. She nodded once. He tapped the page. "The Melody's registration is under an LLC. Guess who owns it?" Harper didn't move, didn't breathe. "Ben," Rowan said. "He hid his name. My guess? So you wouldn't find out." The room seemed to tighten around her. She remembered the first time she'd heard that melody in the edit suite. Clean, warm, a lift in the middle 8 that felt like something personal. She told herself she liked it because it was good business. But now she knew why it had felt like memory. "Do you want me to dig deeper?" Rowan asked carefully. Harper leaned back in her chair, eyes on the skyline. The glass reflected her face in fragments. Sharp cheekbones, tired eyes. "No," she said finally. "That's enough." Rowan didn't press. He closed the folder, left it on her desk, and slipped out of the room. Harper sat still long after the door clicked shut. Outside, the city shifted into evening. Somewhere in Boise, Ben Carter was running a studio, raising 2 daughters, carrying a heart that might not hold out. And the song she had been hearing at every board meeting, Every shareholder pitch, every Skyark ad in Times Square was his. Not coincidence. Not chance. A thread she hadn't seen until now. She pressed her fingers to her temple and exhaled slowly. She had spent years convincing herself that leaving had been the only option, that distance was safety, for both of them. But the melody was still playing in her head, and she knew with a sudden, unshakable clarity. Distance hadn't saved her. It had only made her forget how close she'd once been. Boise was colder than she expected. The air had that high desert clarity that made colors sharper, edges cleaner. Harper stood outside the low brick building with the words City Rehabilitation Center stenciled in fading paint above the door. The parking lot smelled faintly of wet asphalt and pine from a row of young trees lining the curb. Her breath made small clouds. She'd been there for nearly an hour, leaning against the hood of a rented sedan, watching the entrance. Her black coat was too tailored for the place, her boots clicking too neatly on the cracked pavement when she shifted her weight. Then the door swung open. Ben emerged, his hair pushed back in a careless sweep she recognized instantly. He was in a denim jacket over a gray hoodie, jeans frayed at the cuffs. June walked beside him, her small hand wrapped around his fingers, eyes bright beneath the wool hat pulled low over her cochlear implant. Maddie trailed just behind, one hand in her pocket, the other clutching a paperback so worn it might have been read 100 times. June signed something quickly to her father. His head tipped toward her, his mouth moving slowly, eyes warm. She laughed, that clear, unselfconscious sound children have before they learn to filter joy. Harper's hand lifted before she realized it. "Hi," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the space between them. Ben's head turned. His gaze landed on her, and in that instant the years between them collapsed into something sharp, almost physical. No flicker of surprise, just recognition, and then a shuddering, as if he'd closed a door inside himself. "Ben," she said, taking a step forward. He stopped walking. Maddie's eyes darted between them, her shoulders drawing in slightly. June pressed closer to his side. "Choosing to watch," he said, his voice low but steady, "isn't the same as choosing to stay." Harper froze. The words struck with the precision of someone who had carried them for a long time, waiting for the right or wrong moment. "I didn't," she began, but he shook his head once. June looked up at him, then at Harper, curiosity flickering in her small face. Maddie's grip tightened on the book in her hand. Ben stepped back, his hand firm on June's shoulder. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move quickly, but there was finality in the way he angled toward the door again. Harper took another step, but the girls moved with him, close enough that there was no space left for her to bridge without force. The center's glass doors slid open, spilling a gust of warm air over them. He guided the girls inside without looking back. For a moment Harper stood rooted, her breath shallow. The automatic doors closed, cutting off the sound of their steps. All she could see was her own reflection in the glass. A woman who had crossed a continent for a hello and left with a sentence. A delivery van pulled into the lot, its brakes squealing, forcing her to step aside. The driver glanced at her and then away, uninterested in whatever scene had just unfolded. Life here moved on whether she caught up or not. Harper turned toward her car. Her hand was steady on the door handle, but she didn't open it right away. In the reflection on the window, her eyes looked darker, older, like someone who had just been reminded that proximity was not the same as belonging. When she finally slid into the driver's seat, the leather was cold against her palms. She didn't start the engine. Instead, she sat in the thin winter light, the echo of Ben's words looping in her head, feeling like the first verse of a song she wasn't sure she had permission to finish. The roller rink smelled faintly of popcorn, rubber wheels, and the sweet tang of spilled soda that no amount of mopping ever really removed. Saturday morning meant half-price entry, birthday parties in paper hats, and pop songs leaking from slightly crackling speakers overhead. Harper stood just inside the doorway, laces dangling from a pair of rental skates. She had not been on wheels since high school. Her jeans were new, but she'd worn an old sweatshirt under her coat, trying to look like she belonged. She spotted them almost immediately, Maddie and June, near the far end, where a stretch of rail gave beginners something to hold on to. Maddie leaned back against the wall, scrolling on her phone. June was already on the floor, knees bent, her father skating backward in a slow, careful arc so she could follow his cues. The music shifted into a fast track from the 90s, and Harper realized she'd been standing still too long. She pushed out onto the floor, knees stiff, arms slightly out for balance. 2 8-year-olds whizzed past her in a blur. Halfway around, she caught a toe stop and pitched forward. It wasn't graceful. A loud scrape, then her palms flat on the cold, scuffed surface. A teenager in a fluorescent vest skated over, asking if she was okay. She waved him off, laughing under her breath. When she stood, June was watching her. Not unkindly, more like someone observing a puzzle they were curious to solve. Harper wobbled forward again, managing a shaky half-circle until she was near enough to speak without shouting. "Your turn to laugh," she signed clumsily, each movement slow, deliberate. June's eyes widened. Then she grinned, bright and quick. She signed back, something Harper didn't fully catch, but she thought it might be better than my first try. Maddie looked up briefly from her phone, her expression neutral but her gaze lingering a moment longer before returning to the screen. Harper spent the next 20 minutes making cautious loops, sometimes near them, sometimes farther away. Once, she saw June sign to Ben, and he glanced over, not smiling but not closing her out either. When June finally skated toward the benches, Harper followed, unbuckling her skates with a kind of exaggerated relief that made the girl giggle. "Show me?" Harper asked aloud, then repeated in sign with careful hands. "How to fasten better." June's small fingers moved deftly over the straps, tightening them with a practiced pull. Harper watched closely, nodding, repeating the gesture until she got it right. "Perfect," she signed back, her smile real this time. Maddie came over to grab a water bottle from the bench. She didn't speak, but Harper caught her watching from the corner of her eye as June explained something about the wheel lock in quick bursts of movement. By the time the session ended, Harper's legs ached, and her palms still stung faintly from her fall. But when she glanced toward the exit, she saw June tugging on Ben's sleeve, pointing once in Harper's direction before running ahead to the coat rack. Ben didn't approach her, but he didn't turn away either. His eyes met hers across the noisy lobby. Something passed between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the smallest acknowledgement that she was still there. Outside, the cold air felt sharper. Harper walked to her car without looking back, but she could still feel the weight of those small, careful connections. The kind that didn't announce themselves, but settled in quietly, waiting to grow. It was almost midnight when the call came. Harper had been back in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling while the hum of the heating unit filled the silence. She'd been replaying the look on Ben's face at the rink, the quick glances from Maddie, the weight of June's laughter in her chest. The voice on the other end was tight, urgent. A neighbor of Ben's. "There's an ambulance at his place. The girls are with me. Thought you should know." By the time Harper reached the small 2-story house on the quiet street, the paramedics were guiding Ben out on a stretcher. His skin was pale, lips slightly ashen, sweat beading along his temple despite the cold. The heart monitor by his side beeped steadily, too fast. "Arrhythmia," one of the EMTs said as they lifted him into the ambulance. "We'll stabilize en route." Maddie and June stood in the doorway, coats half-zipped, eyes wide and unblinking. Harper crouched to meet them. "It's going to be okay," she said, not sure if she was trying to convince them or herself. The neighbor handed her a folded blanket. "They can stay with me tonight." "No," Harper said before thinking. "I'll stay. Just let me be here." In the small living room, the girls sat on the couch, the blanket wrapped around them like a shared cocoon. June leaned into her sister's shoulder, eyes tracking Harper as she moved about, making tea she wasn't sure anyone would drink. Maddie stayed quiet, her fingers picking at a loose thread in the blanket. Hours later, in the hospital's dim ICU room, Harper sat by Ben's bed. Machines hummed softly. His breathing was steadier now, but his face was drawn, the kind of tired that sleep alone couldn't fix. She rested her hands on the metal rail, leaning forward. Back then, she began quietly, I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. Her voice faltered. After the birth, I had postpartum psychosis. There were days I couldn't tell what was real. Terrifying breaks. I thought I was protecting you by disappearing. Ben's eyes opened slowly. He didn't speak, but the weight in his gaze told her he was listening. There's something else, she said, her throat tightening. Last year, before I sold part of my shares, I went through old Skyark archives. I found a letter from you. You'd asked for help. You'd asked for me. 6 years ago. She swallowed hard. My assistant, Tessa, she intercepted it, said you'd moved on. She thought she was protecting me from whatever mess you were in. She lied. She kept us apart. Ben's jaw shifted slightly, the only sign that the words had landed. I should have found you anyway, Harper whispered. I should have known. The silence between them was thick, but different from the one at the rehab center. Not a wall. More like a field neither had crossed in years, both unsure if they still remembered the path. A nurse came in, checked the monitors, made a quiet note on a chart. When she left, Harper stayed. She didn't move when the first pale light of morning began to leak through the blinds. Ben closed his eyes again, not in dismissal, but in exhaustion. Harper reached out, let her fingers rest briefly against the back of his hand. A touch that asked nothing, promised nothing, except that she was still there. 2 weeks later, the Boise air was warming into early spring. The snowmelt left thin rivulets along the sidewalks, and the wind carried the faint scent of thawing earth. Harper sat at a worn oak desk in her San Francisco office, a signed transfer agreement in front of her. The Skyark logo gleamed at the top, her company's name, but no longer entirely hers. That morning, before the city had fully woken, she'd made the final call to her lawyer. The royalties from the corporate jingle had been redirected. The confirmation email sat in her inbox now. All future payments to Benjamin Carter, sole rights holder. No press release, no announcement, no way for the public to turn it into a headline. Just a quiet correction of a debt she'd only recently learned she owed. Her lawyer had asked, "Are you sure you don't want to keep partial credit?" "No," Harper had replied without hesitation. "It was never mine to keep." By noon, she'd signed the sale of another block of shares and filed for an extended leave from operational leadership. The finance press would speculate endlessly about burnouts, about hostile takeovers, but she didn't care. The glass and steel skyline beyond her office windows felt like another country now. That Friday, she walked into the elementary school where Maddie and June attended. The hallways smelled of crayons, pencil shavings, and cafeteria pizza. Teachers waved politely, some whispering to each other after she passed. Though whether they recognized her from Forbes or simply from the last parent night, she didn't know. In the library, a semicircle of children sat cross-legged on a rug patterned with faded stars. Harper took a seat at the front, a slim picture book in her lap. It was her own, an allegory she had written in the sleepless weeks after leaving Ben, never intended for anyone to read. The Lighthouse Mother. A story about a woman who kept her lamp lit through every storm, even when she thought no one was looking. The manuscript had sat in a drawer for 6 years, but when the librarian had asked her to read something for Family Week, it had been the only book she wanted to bring. Her voice was steady as she read, the children leaning forward at the part where the lighthouse's beam finally reached the little boat in the dark. June's eyes shone, following every word, her hands occasionally moving in small, involuntary signs for light and safe. Maddie sat at the back, arms crossed, one knee bouncing, but her gaze never left Harper's face. The last page turned, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the librarian began to clap. The children followed, the room filling with the small percussion of their hands. Maddie hesitated only a heartbeat before standing. She walked forward slowly, like someone deciding each step. When she stopped in front of Harper, the air between them felt taut, uncertain. Then Maddie leaned in, hugged her. Not a quick, polite squeeze, but the full, anchoring hold of a child letting go of something she'd carried too long. Her whisper was warm against Harper's ear. "I don't need perfect," she said. "I need real." Harper closed her eyes briefly, letting the words settle somewhere deep, somewhere no boardroom could reach. When Maddie pulled back, June was already there, climbing into her lap without asking. Harper's arms wrapped around her instinctively. They sat like that while the other children chattered and shuffled out. In the background, the librarian stacked chairs and pretended not to watch too closely. Weeks had passed since the moment at O'Hare, since the glass had cracked. And now, sitting on the library rug with both girls pressed against her, Harper felt the shift. Not in the noise around them, but in the quiet under it. Outside, the day was bright but soft, the kind of light that didn't demand attention. She thought of the lighthouse in her story, of the way its beam never stopped searching, even when the boat was late to arrive. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for departure. She was staying. And this time, she would keep the light burning. Not for a far-off shoreline, but for the people who were already here. 6 months later, the summer air in Boise was warm but not heavy, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the park's open fields. Julia Davis Park was alive with the quiet bustle of a community evening. Food trucks lined along the curb, families setting out blankets, teenagers tossing frisbees in the long golden light. On a low stage under a string of paper lanterns, a small group of kids was setting up for the concert. Ben stood near the soundboard, wearing a faded Northside Sound t-shirt, speaking into a headset mic as he coordinated cables and checked levels. His movements were slower now, careful, but the lines of strain in his face had softened. There was still the underlying fragility the doctors had warned him about, but his color was better, his breath steady enough to joke with the kids running cables. Harper sat on the grass near the front, her shoes off, toes curling into the cool blades. The evening light turned the edges of everything gold. The guitar cases, the faces in the crowd, even the long silver in Ben's hair. Maddie was at the edge of the stage with a guitar strap over her shoulder, tuning with quiet focus. June stood beside her, hands fluttering in quick signs as she rehearsed the lyrics she'd memorized. When the first notes came, Harper felt them before she recognized them. A familiar melody, one that had once belonged to the world but now, here, felt entirely theirs. Ben's song, the one she had heard in every Skyark boardroom for 2 years, now rearranged, lighter, more open, and layered with new lyrics she had written over the past few months. Words about steady lights and small harbors, about the quiet work of staying. June's voice was clear, Maddie's harmony steady beneath it. Harper caught the small glance Maddie sent her just before the chorus, a flicker of something between pride and invitation. June sang the refrain and signed it at the same time, her hands moving like the song had a second voice no one could mute. Somewhere in the second verse, Harper's vision blurred. She thought of what they'd all carried. The years apart, the letter that never reached her, the words Ben had thrown at her outside the rehab center. She thought of the night in the hospital when she told the truth about her illness, the way his eyes had softened but not forgiven, not yet. And now here he was, steadying a mic stand with one hand while watching their daughters sing a song none of them could have made alone. When the final chord faded, the audience clapped and cheered, and the girls' smiles were wide and unguarded. Maddie jumped down first, June right after. They ran toward Harper, who rose to meet them, the grass cool beneath her bare feet. Maddie hugged her without hesitation, June wrapping her arms around both of them. For a moment Harper closed her eyes, holding on like they might vanish if she let go too soon. Ben was still by the soundboard, one hand resting on the fader, the other tucked into his pocket. When Harper looked over, he was smiling. Not the polite half-smile of an old acquaintance, but the unguarded one she remembered from the very beginning, back when neither of them knew what could be lost. She walked toward him with the girls still flanking her. When she reached him, he extended his hand, and she took it without ceremony. It wasn't an arrival or a return. It was simply the continuation of something that, against all odds, had not ended. They stood together in the warm wash of the lantern light, the sound of the next band tuning up in the background. Harper glanced at the veins in his wrist, the slight tremor in his fingers, the quiet proof that the road ahead might not be easy or long. But then she felt Maddie's shoulder lean into hers, heard June humming the melody under her breath, and she understood something with the clarity of the first sunrise after a storm. Hope wasn't in pretending everything would last forever. Hope was in knowing it might not and staying anyway. The park hummed around them. A baby laughing somewhere behind, the sizzle of a grill, the soft rush of the Boise River nearby. The paper lanterns swayed in the warm breeze, their light shifting over their faces. Harper realized she no longer felt like a visitor from the past. The illusions she'd once clung to, that moving on meant not looking back, that safety meant distance, had burned away. What was left was smaller, quieter, but truer. She looked at Ben, at Maddie with her guitar still slung on her back, at June's small hands shaping the air into words. The lighthouse beam in her story had found its harbor. And even if storms came again, they always did, she would be here when the light was needed. For the first time in years, she wasn't scanning the horizon. She was home,